Today is the 82nd anniversary of the awarding of the Victoria Cross to Corporal John Alexander French of the 2nd 9th Battalion for his actions at Milne Bay. I now ask Bodhi Elizzi, supported by Lysala Tuafo from Ashley State High School, to deliver the student presentation in honour of John French VC.
The Battle for Australia annually commemorates deliverance from what some might describe as modern Australia's darkest hour, a time where the nation found itself facing imminent invasion with no apparent means of support, a time of fear, uncertainty, and darkness. Yet in that darkness, we annually remember the first glimmers of hope that lit the way to safety and ultimate victory. These rays of hope include the Pensacola convoy, the return of the Australian divisions from British North Africa, or the arrival of US Commander Douglas MacArthur. However, the first and brightest ray of hope in the war in the Pacific came not from the overseas liberators, but the homegrown troops fighting their first engagement against the enemy at Milne Bay in August 1942, who proved that Australia could take the fight to the enemy and be victorious. While the arrival and support of forces from overseas throughout 1942 were to be of tremendous comfort and support, the first major engagement with Japanese land forces was to be engineered and led by Australian soldiers like Corporal John Alexander French, who ensured that this first confrontation with the fearsome Japanese war machine would see them confronted, blunted, and driven back. Since the beginning of the Pacific War, the Japanese juggernaut had seemed unstoppable, as one by one, nations and islands in the South Pacific fell like dominoes. The capture of Hong Kong, and even worse, the fall of Singapore, made Australia and her allies realize that they had grossly underestimated the determination and efficiency of the Japanese onslaught, and in the cold light of February 1942, Australia as an island nation seemed especially vulnerable to this unstoppable force coming southwards. Even the entry of the US into the war and the assurances of Great Britain must have seemed only of mild comfort to those who feared any support would arrive too late to save the country from an enemy that they had not seen or engaged, yet seemed to move unchallenged towards Australia like a force of nature. It was a threat that would see the Australian government call for support from its allies as never before. Yet the first major engagement in Japanese forces would not be with the backing of the US or the British. It would be the might of Australia alone that would confront the enemy at Milne Bay in New Guinea, and would be Australians alone who would be the first to halt the Japanese advance, defeat the undefeated enemy, and strike the first blow in the Battle of the Pacific. The first important victory in what would be a long international struggle was due to the determination and courage of Australian-born soldiers like Corporal John French. The story of Corporal John French begins, as does that of many who committed their lives to defend Australia in 1939. John French was one of the first to hear the call and enlist in the first months of the war. He was transferred, like many others, to the UK to fight for the defence of Great Britain as the Nazi menace saw the capture of France and the isolation of the British Isles. As with his fellow Australians, Corporal French was then transferred to North Africa and the major theatre of the British War, to protect the oil fields of the Middle East from the Axis powers. Had fortunes not changed, French and thousands like him would have spent the war overseas as their forefathers would in World War I had, fighting and dying for the interests of the empire. However, fate was to bring John French home to a destiny as a vital hero in the defence of his country in its darkest hour. With the disastrous defeats of Commonwealth forces in the South Pacific, Australia had come to recognise its vulnerability. The unpopular demand that Australian troops be released from British command to return home to defend its own boundaries would see Corporal French and thousands of men from the 7th and 9th Divisions return to the Pacific Theatre. The situation facing the return divisions was a grim one. As the Japanese onslaught moved towards the northern parts of New Guinea, determined to save the strategic lodestone, Corporal French was one of the many men of the 9th Battalion dispatched to a little place known at the time but would soon become a byword for Australian resolve, courage and resistance: Milne Bay. It was at Milne Bay, along with the Battle of the Coral Sea, that the great reversal of fortunes in the War of the Pacific would begin. Long underestimated by their opponents, Japan would fall to the same hubris when they sent forces to capture the airstrips of Milne Bay that would find a resistance waiting for them that was far larger and more determined than the invaders could have anticipated. The Australian and Dutch colonial forces proved to be more than capable of blunting the Japanese attack, putting the invaders on the back foot for the first time. In defense of their homeland and nation, the Australian forces took the fight to the enemy, and what had been predicted initially as a limited skirmish became a ferocious fight to the death. It was in the midst of this maelstrom that Corporal French would earn the Victorian Cross for his courage and fervent determination to save the lives of his comrades. Winners of the Victorian Cross are awarded not for the lives they take, but for those they allow to survive. On the afternoon of September 4th, Jack French was to engage and eliminate not one, but 3 machine gun nests, saving the lives of the men of his unit at the expense of his own. In the aftermath of the Battle of Milne Bay, celebration was limited. The engagement was arduous and casualties were high, but it was due to the efforts of Australian soldiers like John French that the myth of the Japanese invincibility was shattered, and the capability of Australians to fight and protect their own became abundantly clear. The battle for Australia would be long, tearful, and a terrifying struggle. But it was the courage and sacrifice of Corporal French and the men of Milne Bay that ensured that the struggle ultimately ended in victory.